All right, I think we can get started. Hello, everyone, and welcome to the Hay Hill Advisors monthly webinar series. And today we are going to be discussing effective risk triaging for the coverage analysis. Just a little bit of housekeeping before we start into the content. So Hay Hill Advisors is beginning a new series of webinars on clinical research billing. This is our second in that series. If you are signed up for this webinar, you will receive notifications of others unless you opt out. The webinars will be recorded in case you missed the live sessions, and we'll send out those recordings. And we're going to be hosting the webinars on a monthly basis. Generally, we're starting out on kind of a twice monthly basis, but we'll settle into a monthly basis. And in general, we plan for 50 minutes of content, and then we're going to hold 10 minutes of questions for questions. So if you do have a question, you can put it into the chat box, and that'll go directly just to Ryan and I, and we can read the questions. We're not going to read your name or your organization's name, so there'll be a little anonymity there. So feel free to add any questions during any point during the conversation, but we'll answer them in the last 10 minutes. So just an overview of what we're going to discuss today. First, we're going to just generally talk about what is risk in a global sense. Then we'll talk about what are the risks in the context of clinical research billing. Then we will discuss the risk profile, specific CRB activities, just a couple examples there. We'll talk about some takeaway points, and then we'll open it up for some questions. So what is risk? Let's begin by going back to the basics. So to put it simply, risk is the possibility of something bad happening. We underlined the word possibility on the slide because risk cannot be predetermined and it can never be fully eliminated because it exists in the future. Risk cannot be fully eliminated because it is inherently tied to the possibility of an adverse event occurring whenever an action is taken. Since every action, decision, or situation involves some level of uncertainty, the potential for harm, loss, or failure always exists. It's inherent to the process of acting. Even with the most advanced precautions and safeguards, there is no way to account for all variables or completely prevent unexpected outcomes. So risk is an unavoidable part of any action or decision. Therefore, it can only be managed or minimized, but never fully eradicated. If we're talking specifically about healthcare and healthcare billing, healthcare is a human-driven process, and to err is human. So human frailty is an inherent part of the healthcare billing process. There are a lot of different people that touch the process, and you can't account for everything every single person is going to do, and that's okay. That's okay because it's important to acknowledge that this risk exists and that it cannot be eliminated. I'm looking outside right now, and it's cold where I am, and there's a thin layer of snow on the ground. And if I was to go outside and take a walk, I can't eliminate the risk of something bad happening to me. In this case, it would be me getting cold or slipping on the sidewalk or something like that. There are things I can do that would mitigate this risk. I can wear a hat and put a scarf on and put gloves on and my heaviest jacket and put boots on with good traction. But I can't eliminate the risk that I'm going to potentially get cold and potentially slip. It's important to accept that there is a little risk in everything that we do, professionally or otherwise, and to try to eliminate all risk is an error in itself. First, because it's unrealistic. All actions involve risk. And second, it's oftentimes counterproductive to try to eliminate risk, all risk. Trying to eliminate all risk requires a tremendous amount of resources to try to game out every scenario that could potentially happen. And then you have to double, triple, quadruple, check everything every single time. And this, when you try to eliminate all risk, you're kind of like we talked about last time, you're on this road to infinity that can lead an individual or an organization to some level of paralysis, and also unintended consequences and inefficiencies, and ultimately all for diminishing returns. There's only so much time and energy and money that can be deployed, and it needs to be deployed efficiently. The only way to ensure that you don't lose is to never play. If the Los Angeles Lakers were playing a high school basketball team, there still exists a risk that they can lose. That risk is very low, so we'd say that that risk is very well managed, but that risk still exists. The only way for the Lakers to ensure that they don't lose to a high school basketball team is to not play a game. So risk can be managed with controls, but never fully eliminated. Ryan, do you have anything to add on that?
I think what I would add to that is that it leads to what is a big theme for today, and that is to approach decision making, particularly with format and with processes that are going to repeat, with a risk framework. One of the things that we mentioned in the last webinar was that we we've seen over the past couple of years some new themes developing around clinical research billing and coverage analysis, not because there are changes of laws or even changes in how the government approaches this, but there seems to be settling across the country an approach to developing coverage analyses and formats that are trying to control for all possibilities. And we talked about the all possibilities CAs. We discussed the difference between CTMS driven CAs and revenue cycle CAs. If I had a diagnosis for this trend, which is making coverage analyses formats more complicated, I think it's because there isn't a risk framework brought to bear on the decisions that need to be made in clinical research billing and in coverage analysis format. And that it's sort of understandable why this is occurring. And I have to say, I've been giving talks and lectures and working in this arena for a couple of decades, and it took a long time. It took 15, 16 years in many cases to get people to even recognize that there is a risk. That might seem odd for many of you who recognized the risk a long time ago, or you're early in your career in clinical research billing and doing coverage analyses, and working with them. But it took a long, long time for the research community to recognize that there's a risk. But what has happened the past couple of years is that there's been an acceptance of the risk, but a lot of decisions, it seems like, could benefit from a risk framework. So as we go deeper into today, we're going to be applying this basic concept of risk that Chris talked about in the context of healthcare, in the context of billing, and in the context of research billing, to try to help you think about a risk framework. This is actually totally normal, that this is what happens in industries. This is not something that's unique to research billing or to hospitals or medical schools or healthcare. Every industry that goes through a period of time where it takes a while to recognize what a risk is, what could be the bad thing that could happen, and the possibility, it tends to then overcorrect for that, and then it has to think about how to get back to a risk framework. So those are my extra introductory thoughts.
Yeah, so let's talk about risk in the context of clinical research billing. So it's like Ryan was saying, it's important, very important, to understand clinical research billing risk. And to do so, we need to ask, what is the bad thing that could happen? So the controls to manage a risk should be proportionate to the potential bad thing that can happen. If we're talking about nuclear reactors or aviation safety or biohazardous waste, the controls to manage that risk should be incredibly thorough because the risk is incredibly high. So that figuring out what the bad thing that can happen is important because that helps us develop our risk profile. The risks associated with clinical research billing are not as dire as they are for nuclear reactors, for example, but there are bad things that can happen. So we have from we created here a hierarchy of bad things that can happen in clinical research billing, and this is all based on the False Claims Act, which is the operative law that is that we're operating under when we present a claim to the federal government, like the Medicare program. So the highest legal risk under the False Claims Act is receiving an overpayment as a result of intentional fraud or reckless disregard. Reckless disregard is, you don't, it's not intentional fraud, but you don't really care if you're doing something right or not. Um, that's the highest legal risk. An intermediate legal risk is receiving an overpayment when there is no defensible billing justification. So in this instance, it would be, all right, we don't have intentional fraud. We're not trying to defraud anybody. There's not reckless disregard. We do have some safeguards here, but we still received an overpayment when there is no defensible billing justification for that service. That's an intermediate legal risk. Then we have the lower legal risk, which is receiving an overpayment due to a simple mistake that can be corrected. So this is just, oops, during the claim scrubbing process, something got diverted the wrong direction. It went out to insurance. We received an overpayment, and we shouldn't have. That can be corrected. Um, I will say that for this lower legal risk, receiving the overpayment, because it can be corrected if caught, is not actually a risk. The receiving of it is not actually a risk. The keeping of that overpayment is the actual risk. So that's why we have it a lower legal risk, because those simple mistakes, if caught in time, can be corrected, and then the risk is eliminated. And then the lowest tier that we have under the False Claims Act hierarchy of bad things is a process risk. And this is actually not a legal risk on its own. And those are some of it's omitting or incorrectly using the informational coding points that do not have any bearing on payments. So specifically here, we're talking about the Q1 and the Q0 modifiers. Uh, if you omit or incorrectly use a Q1 or a Q0, it has no bearing on the payment that you're going to receive, and it doesn't generate an overpayment. There is a Supreme Court case, it's the Escobar case, that was decided unanimously 9-0, that these informational data points and these informational coding points involved on a claim, they're not determinative of whether that claim as a whole is right or wrong. You want to get those informational points correct. The government would like for you to get those informational points correct, but if you use something incorrectly, or if you forget to do a Q1, Q0, that does not make the claim false under the False Claims Act. That money that you receive from a federal health plan is not an overpayment if you screw up these informational coding points. So that's more of a process risk that doesn't generate a money legal risk on its own. So yeah, this is the hierarchy of underneath the False Claims Act, and those process risks are the lowest on that hierarchy.
And I'll add in here that this hierarchy of risks, and we've sort of put this in the context of the False Claims Act, and added a little bit of CRB at the end. This is a hierarchy that we've been using for a very long time, and it's something that I've been in my law school courses on this, like I've been teaching for 25 years. This hierarchy of risk. This is also generally the hierarchy of risk when you're doing a compliance internal investigation or a legal internal investigation to assess whether there are false claims liabilities that an organization has. What you're doing in the investigation and audit is you're collecting facts, and then the facts need to be run up against the False Claims Act to identify whether there is any legal exposure, and if there is legal exposure, how bad is the legal exposure? Because there's a range of penalties and so forth. And so this is loosely how lawyers, when they're thinking about the False Claims Act and whether there's exposure to how they're analyzing the facts and the audit results to come up with the legal results. And if you look at highest, intermediate, and lower for a moment, you see in there that another way we can put this is, so in the highest legal risk, when you're intentionally trying to defraud, so this is somebody who's really bad intent. This is somebody who's trying to pull the wool over the government's eyes, right? You're in there to try to get money that you know you shouldn't have. Now that just submitting the claim with that level of intent, and this is important. This is a technical point, but that's intent. You intend to do something, even if you don't succeed in the end result of getting the money that you want. You've intended to defraud. So at that high legal risk arena, yeah, even if you don't get an overpayment, putting wrong information on a claim, getting it wrong, that's a problem. Okay, but thankfully that is rare, and that's where compliance programs help in trying to make sure people are know that that's wrong and that's you shouldn't do this. This is also where the risk controls are, where if you're doing in the CRB context, if you're doing a coverage analysis, that in of itself is usually an example that you're trying in good faith to manage the risk and not do something intentional. You can't control every person, and you can have bad actors slip in, but that usually just having some sort of process where you're trying to get it right will manage and minimize the risk at the highest level quite a bit. Now you go to that intermediary level, and and I would add in there that if you do get the overpayment, right, what's in that top risk is an overpayment plus intentional fraud or intent or reckless disregard, as Chris described. You're really just purposefully ignoring. This is burying your head in the sand on purpose because you don't want to know whether something is right or not. But that goes to the act of submitting. Very, very high risk, but thankfully the easiest to control. The intermediary legal risk, like receiving an overpayment where there's no defensible billing justification, this is something more than just a simple mistake. This is where it's like happening a lot. There's a systemic failure, and you could have tried, but you didn't try. Like now, like getting that overpayment, even if you turn the money back, receiving that overpayment has liability and exposure. That lower legal risk that Chris described, and it's important to see what we've written here, receiving an overpayment due to a simple mistake. This happens every single day. I don't think it's controversial to say there isn't a hospital in the country that doesn't make a simple mistake every day, because we all make simple mistakes every day. And the law understands that. The government understands simple mistakes. So simple mistakes that happen isolated, that even receiving that money, that's not, you receive an overpayment, that doesn't have legal exposure if it's a simple mistake. The legal exposure comes, as Chris described, when you realize you got an overpayment and you decide not to return it. And that's where a simple mistake does turn into legal exposure, when you make that decision not to return the overpayment. And you think about this in a clinical research billing context and a coverage analysis. Most folks listening in today probably are not decision makers on whether to return the money or not. I know we do have a few people that may be there, but most of the people who develop coverage analyses, they don't have any control over number three. They don't have any control over the simple mistakes that happen. They don't have a control over the decision whether to return it. And this goes back to the theme that we mentioned at the beginning. It does strike me that some of the overcomplexity we're seeing across the country and in coverage analyses the past couple of years is trying to control, it's recognizing that there is still risk down here in number three. and trying to control for the all possibilities, but it's not controllable, because it's the coverage analysis is actually the wrong mechanism to try to control for number three. So no matter how much you try to expand or try to think through all the possibilities in a coverage analysis, you're actually never going to get from number two to number three here. And that process risk that Chris talked about, this we get this question a lot, and I'm glad people ask it, because they're it's hard. It's just hard stuff to figure out what what instructions from the government are actual laws, what are regulatory rules, what are guidances, what are things that they'd like to see, and not everything has carries with it a potential exposure or liability if you get it wrong. And a lot depends on why you're getting it wrong. So yeah, number four can actually pop back up to number one if you're intentionally hiding. So if you accidentally leave off a Q1, Q0, you mix up Q0 from Q1, that's information that is, CMS is very clear. They don't make decisions about payment based on Q1 or Q0. It's information they'd like to have. It's information they do data analytics on, but it doesn't drive their decision whether to pay or not. But there's a very big difference between, oh, we're going to hide the information. Somebody, bad actor, wants to disguise that this is happening in a coverage in a clinical trial, probably because they're thinking, oh, we're not going to get paid if we give them all the information. They might be wrong about that, but that's bad act. That goes back up to number one. But most of the time, what we see is organizations have attempts and initiatives to try to get it right. But it's pretty hard to get this squeaky clean right. But that's okay. This isn't something that you are going to the government's going to make a decision over. So okay.
Yeah. So that's the legal risk, and there are secondary risks involved in clinical research billing, and we have kind of two main buckets for that. The first is financial risk. So this is existing outside of the legal risk of presenting a false claim. We organizations would like for their research studies to at least cover costs. And there are some financial risks involved in clinical research billing and not doing so. So some financial risks involved in clinical research billing, not negotiating enough payment from the sponsor to cover the costs of the research study, just generally. And then also there's a risk in missing out on better payment opportunities when balancing insurance payments versus sponsor payments. This could be, maybe the sponsor is offering to pay for a variety of lab tests, but under the coverage rules, you can bill for those lab tests. What we normally see in these sponsors' budgets is that the sponsors' payment for those lab tests are going to be higher than the payment that you'd receive from insurance. So if you say, "Oh, actually, sponsor, I know that you're offering to pay for this, but we don't need to take the money because we can bill insurance for that." That is presenting a financial risk because the organization is missing out on a better payment opportunity, more advantageous amount of money that they're receiving for these services. So there are those financial risks to take into account as well outside of the legal risks that you want to think about when you are putting together coverage analysis, and particularly when you're negotiating a budget. And there are also internal process risks, and these don't generally rise to the level of legal risk or financial risk. But there is risk to not following policies and procedures. You want things to be done in an orderly way, and you want things to be done in a way that is replicable if across the organization. And also internal process risks, missing timed activation goals. We would include that in these process risks. If you being effective at timed activation is going to inure to your benefit as an organization, because the sponsors, they're very focused on timed activation because they want their data that is going to come out of the work that the institution is conducting for them as quickly as possible. So as if you can start these studies as soon as you possibly can, that's going to get you in a better leveraging position when you're negotiating with the sponsor, and will lead to fewer issues down the line. So some of those process risks, they do exist, but we view them generally as secondary to the legal risks, obviously, and then also the financial risks. And every organization has to kind of think through their own unique risk profile. No two institutions across the country are the same in their risk profile. Um, in an environment in which risk cannot be eliminated, choices need to be made at an institutional level about where to focus your energy. There's only so many resources, only so much time, there's only so many people that are going to be managing this risk. So developing a risk profile is very important, so you can focus those energies in a way that the organization decides is most efficient and useful for the organization as a whole, with these risks, the legal risk, the financial risk, and the internal process risks in mind. Um, and then now we're going to discuss some specific CRB activities and how they fit within a general risk framework. So for that, I'm going to turn this over to Ryan.
Great, thanks, Chris. So we have four topics that we're going to discuss that are very discrete. Physician discretion services, procedures with variable bundled services, self-administered drugs, and prescription drugs. Now, here's how I'm going to go through these. We only have one slide for each of them. I'm going to state right up front here that there's no right or wrong decision on how to reflect these four items on, four topics really, on a coverage analysis. Probably the only thing that an organization can do wrong with these four is to not use a risk framework in thinking about these. And I would say, and we'll get to like one of these, where even if you're not using a risk framework because of the way one of these falls, the self-administered drugs, you're actually, the organization is by default forced into one of the decisions. But a risk framework will help you decide how much effort to put in, how much money to spend sometimes, because if you're outsourcing this, it could cost more. If your CA looks double the norm from the industry standard, it will, if you've got your coverage analysis tied in with your CTMS calendar, it could go and some of these decisions might expand your calendar quite a bit. That could take longer to develop the calendar, cost more, make the study team look at the calendar and say, gosh, I thought I was doing a 10 service study, and now I'm looking at 250 lines, and maybe I'm going to think twice about using the calendar, right? So there's a lot of things that go back and forth here, but and none of these really have a right or wrong answer. But you have to think about them. And what we are seeing is like, if there isn't a risk framework that these topics are put through, then there does tend to be you're traveling on the road to infinity, because it's very difficult to know when to stop with your detail or your options, or because you're trying to accommodate all sorts of sort of possibilities, and you can't get there. And that's like I mentioned earlier, it's like the moving from trying to add risk controls, moving from number 2 to number 3. The coverage analysis isn't the right risk control that your aim is shooting for. So we're going to go through these, and we'll talk about this. One of the things that Chris and I have started is we've started a side series of videos called CRB in 10 minutes. And in the CRB in 10 minutes, we're handling super discrete issues and fleshing them out a little bit more. Uh, we uploaded our first one on PET scans and the NCD on PET scans last week. And we're going to be doing some discrete standalone CRB in 10-minute videos on most of these that are here, at least 3 out of the 4. So look for those over the next couple of weeks. So we'll be able to get more into detail here, but just probably the framing today. So let's move on to the first one, physician discretion services. And we want to start with an easy one. This one, most of the time, we don't see organizations now struggling too much with the physician discretion point, but it is that it does still come up, right? And sometimes there are things that are in the protocol that it might not look like it's physician discretion at first, but you have to dive a little bit deeper, and then you realize it's physician discretion. But we wanted to start with this because most people on the call today have had experience where physician discretion services are put on the CA, and then at some point you realize, yeah, this isn't really a risk that needs to be controlled. And I'll explain why here in just a second. And so most organizations have either put the physician discretion services on, they put some type of a neutral designation with respect to billing on it, and just to note, and they say this is physician discretion, or they will put it as billable because it's going to be medically necessary, or they just leave it off entirely. We tend to see now most organizations leaving off physician discretion services entirely. And again, this is I think it's a great topic, and especially if you've gone through this process of thinking on how it's a natural process to go from, okay, we've identified the big risks. Now we're putting in risk controls. And now we're seeing, yeah, a few of these controls, like we tried out, we can dial back a little bit because it turns out that these aren't risks after all, or the risks that we can't control. So protocols often reference clinical services, but leave it up to the physician's discretion whether to order the service. There's a lot of reasons why protocols might put a physician discretion service in there. One is just to warn the physician, let the physician know that if something happens, here are suggestions on how you can try to manage the adverse event and so forth. And that's like giving some good suggestions for the doctor to think about. But ultimately, it's up to the doctor on how to respond to a patient's presentation. Whenever there's an adverse event or serious adverse event or something bad happens, or there's just disease progression, the doctor has to be a doctor at that point. And that means focusing on that patient and responding to that patient's needs. At that point, the protocol is very secondary, because if the protocol dictated how to respond to an adverse event, then the doctor isn't thinking about the patient, and they're not thinking about how to respond to the signs and symptoms or the whatever is manifesting in the presentation of the patient. They're thinking about an algorithm document, and that's not good. So I don't know too many doctors who would do that, and in these situations it pretty much doesn't happen. And so the protocols sometimes describe this so that the doctors can think ahead of time about what they might have to think about. Other times, just got to be honest, the pharma company or device manufacturer, they're putting in suggestions here to cover themselves from their risk management perspective. They're just putting in suggestions so that if something bad happens and there's a lawsuit, they can point to the protocol and say, see, doctor, I told you to think about it and you didn't think about it. So there are times when physician discretion things are in protocols that are simply defensive mechanisms for the sponsor. It's not wrong. I mean, they've got to think about their defenses and the landscape of litigation and malpractice cases today. But it's really important for clinical research billing folks, coverage analysis people, to recognize that physician discretion services are not services that are mandated by the protocol. They are suggestions for the doctor, and the doctor makes a decision. So if a service is left to the discretion of a physician, then that service is not essential for the data analysis to test the study's hypothesis. This is super important if you just step back and think about what a research study is doing. A research study is an experiment. And some of them are interventional experiments. Some of them are experiments that are data collecting. The experiment is a test of a hypothesis. It may not be an experiment of something that's never been done before, but it's a test, it's an experiment of a hypothesis. And in order to assess a hypothesis, you need research data that's controlled and is consistent. Or you have to just fully disclose that you're dealing with anecdotal data and not controlled data. So if a protocol isn't requiring a doctor to do something every single time, then if something happens and that data is used, it might be useful in the overall analysis, but it's not going to be an essential datum for the testing of the hypothesis, right? So this is an important point is that even though not everything that a protocol suggests or describes is study related, even though it might be in the protocol, you have to parse this. So now, if there's no requirement for a physician to perform a service, then the physician is not going to order the service unless the service is medically necessary. This is just something, as I described, doctors, in general, they're not supposed to order services that are not medically necessary. That's not a research point. That's just a general clinical care point. So if the protocol leaves it up to the doctor, it's completely in the doctor's discretion, and the research study doesn't need that data, then the decision on that service is going to be the doctor's assessment on whether it's medically necessary. And that decision is independent of the study protocol. And as I mentioned, just because it's in the study protocol doesn't mean it's research focused or it's study required. At first, if you've never thought through this, it can be daunting to think, okay, well, I've got to read through this scientific document that could be 100 pages and figure out what's study required or not. That is natural to think about that, but many of you have done this before. Many of you do it every day. It actually isn't that hard, because in the schedule of events, if something is mentioned that isn't required, the protocol is going to have a footnote to say that it's the clinical discretion of the physician, the physician's discretion, or it might even be in a parenthetical that's written into the schedule of events. It's going to be clear. And here's why. Because the sponsor does not want to, if something doesn't need to happen, the sponsor doesn't want to do that data crunching. So there's the sponsors usually get this right. I would say they're usually pretty clear. So yeah, you could spend 100 hours like pouring through it, but that in itself is a risk framework. Is you just want to take it as it comes. If the sponsor doesn't say that it's clinical discretion, then you assume that it's study required. But if it's a recommendation, doctor's discretion, clinical discretion, all these sort of terms, then it's physician discretion services. And the organization needs to think from a risk framework, is that worth putting on the CA or not? Because it's not study required. And there's a presumption that when a doctor orders something that's medically necessary, it gets billed. And there could be edits in the billing system. There can be there's all sorts of things that control outside of research for the quote unquote billing rules. But inside of a coverage analysis, generally organizations now have gone through the risk framework and they defer that process of applying all the other billing rules to the hospital's normal billing process, because outside of research, everything that happens outside of research is physician discretion services. And there are lots and lots of controls that revenue cycle offices put in place for this. Okay, we'll move on to the next one. Let's spend more time on that one, mostly because many of you have gone through it, and I want you to just recognize the risk framework thinking as we go into some things which are a little bit harder, but to try to analogize it to what you've gone through with physician discretion services. So variable bundled services. So some procedures involve services that support the core service, but are variable by patient. And there's lots of examples that we could give. I'll just give you one that comes up a lot for us. And we help a lot of organizations think through this. Everybody kind of has to think through it at some point. And that's what happens during the infusion of a study drug. So the study drug might be provided free by the sponsor, but as long as you have a QCT, a qualifying clinical trial, if the sponsor isn't paying for the administration of the drug, you can bill the administration of the drug. Okay. So, but sometimes the sponsor will pay for the administration of the drug, especially in phase 1 studies, early phase studies, or you just have a good, generous sponsor that's doing it, or we have a few clients who just require it as a matter of policy that they pay for the administration. So when a sponsor pays for the administration of a study drug, they're not just paying usually for the they're not just paying usually for the act of infusing the drug. They're usually paying a lump sum amount that covers whatever is going on in infusing the drug. So there is a very specific CPT code. There's a couple CPT codes depending on how long the infusion takes for the administration. And so yes, sometimes the sponsor is only paying for that very specific CPT code. That's fine. The pre-meds and other medications, you can sort through and think through to bill. But most of the time, what we find that when the sponsor is trying to pay for the administration of the drug, they're not just trying to pay for that act of infusing and those CPT codes that are solely focused on infusing the drug. They're really just trying to give you a bundle of money, for lack of a better way to put it, that covers whatever's going on with that infusion. They're actually trying to make it easy for you. and it's a business decision. It's a budgeting decision. If you want to be super precise and narrow the money down to the act of administering, but this is one where sponsors actually, are trying to make it easier for folks. But people can make it more complicated than it is if they try to think through every single possibility that the doctor might use or order with pre-meds for the infusion right before the infusion is given, or management meds that occur while the infusion is given. If it can be, in between bags, they might infuse some sort of management drug to try to keep side effects under control and so forth. You can't predict that, what those are going to be. The protocol might suggest some, and sometimes the protocol does require certain drugs be given. Sometimes you have to give dexamethasone. Sometimes you have to give Benadryl, if the person can handle it, and all sorts of things that you might have to do. But there are also suggestions that the doctor might think about on, based on the patient's history and presentation. And what organizations struggle with is they accept that the sponsor is trying to pay for that whole bucket of whatever is going on. How do they represent that on the coverage analysis? And this is something where you do have to think through this. And so but here's a really basic principle. If there are things that the sponsor absolutely wants the doctor to do and to order, then yes, those drugs associated with administration should be on the coverage analysis. Drugs that are just suggestions that the doctor has to make a decision on, well, some organizations have tried to put all of those on, but those are usually just suggestions, and it's not going to move it from second level risk to control third level risk, because you can't control all possibilities. So in the drugs that are left to the doctor, that this will vary, and they will be ordered by the doctor that will be medically necessary if they're left to the physician's decision. So this type of an example of a bundled service actually ties in quite a bit with the physician discretion services, and it goes to the many ways a coverage analysis is used. You'll probably end up in paralysis and on the road to infinity if you try to capture every possible pre-med or drug management med on a coverage analysis, when really the risk control is not with the coverage analysis. The risk control is with the people who are charge separating and reviewing the charges. They have to be trained and they have to know when to look for these pre-meds and infusion management meds. And that is usually when the administration of the drug is marked as an S, if you're using S for sponsor or study paid. That's a signal to, usually a signal to the the charge separation folks to try to capture all those drugs that are used that the sponsor is paying for the event of administering. But you're never going to be able to capture all the possibilities that could occur in CPT codes and services on your coverage analysis that could occur during that event that the sponsor is paying for. I'm not exaggerating in that if you probably would have to put the 3/4 of the hospital's charge master into the coverage analysis to try to capture all those possibilities. So this is something, again, no right or wrong answer here, but you've got to think through this with a risk framework and then establish some consistent approaches for dealing with this. And the answer may not be in the coverage analysis. It may be on the charge separation. Now, self-administered drugs. Many of you have struggled with this. Many organizations continue to struggle with this. This is a hard one. And the basic point is up on top. Medicare does not allow coverage for drugs that are quote unquote self-administered in a hospital, outpatient clinic, or physician office, except under limited circumstances. We are definitely doing a full free standalone video on self-administered drugs because this is not a rule that CMS has come up with. This is a rule that Congress came up with. So it is something that is wired into a statute. And it does get complex because this only applies to Medicare Part B situations, which are listed here in the first point. Hospital outpatient clinics or physician offices. This rule does not apply to inpatient settings, which is Medicare Part A. It doesn't apply to pharmacy settings, of course, which is Medicare Part D. And there are exceptions, which means this is sort of a double negative situation where Medicare at first doesn't cover any drugs that are self-administered in the outpatient setting. And then it has exceptions, meaning that they do cover certain drugs. So as we have it framed here, they don't cover except under limited circumstances. There's a really big one that they do cover. And that's one of those limited exceptions where there's coverage is antiemetics during cancer treatment. And as an example, there may be drugs that are given as pre-meds or medical management drugs during administration that have a distinction. They have different purposes. Some are antiemetics to manage nausea. Some are to manage allergic reactions. Medicare doesn't cover self-administered drugs in an outpatient setting to try to manage allergic reactions, even if they're medically necessary. So my constant example of Benadryl, right, is a very inexpensive drug, very good at managing allergic reactions. For most people, it's going to be medically necessary, but it's not covered because it's usually self-administered. But dexamethasone, is an example. It can go both ways. If it's trying to be used as an antiemetic, if there's others, there's some benzos that are used as antiemetics. Those are going to be covered. This is it gets a little complex here. But here's the point, and again, our video will go through the different exceptions. What I really want to get down to is this last big point with the three options. Self-administered drugs are often required by a protocol. So we're not in the area of physician discretion anymore. This is like these need to be given during the protocol. So they need to go on the coverage analysis. But you have to decide what to do. If you have a non-covered self-administered drug, what is the organization going to do with this? Are you going to have the sponsor pay for the self-administered drug because it's not covered? And it's not covered because it's in research. It's not covered because Congress has made a law that these things aren't covered anytime by Medicare, inside of research, outside of research. But you might make a decision, yep, we're always going to ask the sponsor to pay for non-covered self-administered drugs. You might not ask the sponsor to pay, and you might write off non-covered self-administered drug charges. Again, we'll cover it in the video on this, but there is a OIG guidance on how they're okay with hospitals writing off charges for non-covered self-administered drugs, as long as you're not advertising it to the patient and so forth. This isn't some type of beneficiary inducement. So this is a legitimate option. A lot of our hospital clients have taken this option, and they've applied it outside of research, and just across the board, they follow the OIG guidance and they write off, and they don't charge anybody for the non-covered self-administered drugs. Some of our clients have thought through this, and they charge for the self-administered drugs outside of research. They'll go to the patient, but during research, they write it off. They make that decision. Or the third option is to have the patient pay for non-covered self-administered drugs. And this is when I say up here in the parenthetical, you can't avoid a decision. This last point is the default. So if you don't make a decision, what happens is a non-covered self-administered drug charge goes on the claim, it will get denied, and then that denied charge will fall to patient pay. And for the most part, this is sort of what happens. And organizations just need to think through this. There's no right or wrong answer here. It's what does the organization want to do? Some do have sort of an ethical overlay, and they decide they want to get the sponsor to pay. That's fine. Many organizations still have the patients pay, but you have to think through it because you have to represent this on the coverage analysis somehow. Okay, go on to the next one. Prescription drugs are dispensed at retail pharmacies. A lot of prescription drugs are required in some studies, especially, we're seeing more and more in cancer studies where they're required prescription drugs, but in cardiology studies, almost every cardiology study, not 100%, but almost all, requires some prescription drugs, mainly because the cardiology patient is either already on prescription drugs, and it might even be an inclusion criteria that they're on certain drugs or need certain drugs, or they've had some event, they get a device, and then they're going to have to be on some prescription drugs for the rest of their life. So these get wired into the protocol, and decisions have to be made. So even though this one is wired into the protocol, there's a question of, does it need to be on your coverage analysis? If you can't control, like if you don't have control over, you can't do anything to control this because the activity in the billing is occurring by retail pharmacies. Most hospitals don't own or manage or are responsible for retail pharmacies. Virtually all schools of medicine do not own or control retail pharmacies. And in general, patients are given a free choice of what retail pharmacy to use. You get a prescription and you can go to Walgreens, CVS, Rite Aid, or your local mom and pop shop. And the other thing is prescription drug coverage falls under Medicare Part D with completely different coverage rules than Medicare Part A or Medicare Part B. So oftentimes, if the drug is being given in a hospital setting or a physician office setting, we've got to use some analysis on label, off label, and if it's off label, you got to put it through a specific coverage framework. But none of those rules apply to retail pharmacies because Medicare Part D is a totally different creature. It uses a separate set of statutes. Uh, there are some on-label uses of drugs that Medicare Part D doesn't cover, a small number. There are some off-label uses that Medicare Part D covers without going through at all the mental gymnastics you have to do for a hospital-based administration of an off-label or off-label use of drug. But at the end of the day, does your organization control the billing for the patient's retail pharmacy? Um, the likely answer there is no, that you don't, especially if the patient is given a choice. And generally, prescription drugs are they're going to be medically necessary, and it might be required by the study, but oftentimes those are wired into the dynamics and the characteristic of the subject who meets the inclusion criteria. So this is something where, by and large, most of our clients have put this through a risk framework, and they've decided to keep these off. So we're coming up close to the top of the hour, and we'll flip to the takeaway points, and Chris will run through those quickly, and we'll go through any questions.
All right, yes. So just about finished with time, so we'll just hit these takeaway points, and then if there are any questions, that feel free to email us. But we'll have the email link at the end here. So some takeaway points from our perspective. The main material risks associated with clinical research billing have to do with payment received by the organization. So that's mainly the legal risk and the financial risk. So the legal risk is receiving payment from a federal healthcare program for a service performed during a research study that the organization is not entitled to. That is an overpayment. On the financial risk side, not adequately negotiating or turning down payment from the sponsor for a service that is covered under Medicare rules, but not paid or paid very little. So that's underfunding. So the main takeaway here is that the main material risks associated with clinical research billing, the clinical research billing process, have to do with money and money that is actually received by the organization. So that's an important point to keep in mind. An organization only has so many resources to expend when it comes to CA development and clinical research billing process generally. Risk cannot be fully eliminated, but it can be managed in an efficient manner. And managing risk does not mean zero risk, but minimizing the chances that something bad can happen. Couple questions that we'll leave you with here. Is your organization focusing its time, energy, and resources during CA development on things that actually manage material risk? Is your organization using a risk framework to think through its CA decisions? And just to close here, thanks for listening. I just wanted to run through some of the things that Hay Hill Advisors does. We provide strategic advising, research compliance and process assessments, education and training, coverage analysis development, Medicare payment analysis development, and claim scrubbing services. And you can contact us at admin@hayhilladvisors.com, and feel free to send any questions that you do have regarding this material to that email as well. So we are
And
now
we also
at.
got, oh, I was just going to say, Chris, we got one question that came in, which I know we're at the top of the hour, and I want to answer this like super quick because it's a really good one. The question is, if you're not syncing the coverage analysis, the draft coverage analysis, with the final executed clinical trial agreement and budget and IRB approved ICF, is that a process risk that could lead to, that is a legal risk? This is a super good question, because it is a process risk. It is a very high process risk, because not syncing is illegal. It's because there is a high possibility that if you are just using the draft coverage analysis in your claims review process and not syncing that draft coverage analysis to a final budget that's been executed by all the parties, that could lead to erroneous billing and overpayments. So that's a really great question, because the act of not syncing in and of itself is not illegal. It's the result could be overpayments, and this is something we get a lot when we do audits and internal investigations. You could imagine where we might find in an audit that a draft coverage analysis has not been synced with the final budget. If nobody has been enrolled in the study and there's never been any billing for it, then it's no harm, no foul, because there's no possibility of an overpayment, because there's been no billing. If there has been somebody enrolled, yep, that is something where you got to look deeper on that, because it could have led to an overpayment. So the process itself is still just like not, the failure is not illegal, but there are certain ones like that, which is a risk. That is a major risk control. That's very different than a Q0, Q1. That's a major risk control to prevent level 1 and level 2 risk that we talked about. So anyway, great question. And thanks for everybody who hung on the extra 2 minutes. We appreciate your time.
All right. Thanks so much. We'll see you next time.